Hello and welcome to the rewards and challenges of an InnerSource practice. I'm Denise Cooper, and it's been a while since I spoke in Korea, so thank you very much for the opportunity. And let's get started. The term InnerSource was actually coined by Tim O'Reilly in 2000, which is a long time ago now. At the time, Tim O'Reilly was working on a company called Collab.net together with Brian Behlendorf, who co-founded the Apache Software Foundation. Collab.net was founded to teach people how to do open source methods inside of proprietary companies, because they were convinced that it was a better way to create software. But they had a hard time selling this idea because open source had not won in the marketplace, and people who didn't want to see the change in their companies would simply say, this isn't going to happen. And then open source won. Around 6 years ago, it became well established that everyone in the tech industry was dependent on open source. I believe even Samsung. And at that moment, it became viable to reintroduce the idea of InnerSource. Because most engineers in the world weren't working in an open source way. And I like to think that they were working in the salt mines, meaning they were up to their ankles in the old-fashioned ways of doing things, which were proving to be not as nimble. A lot of companies had accreted serious technical debt, which is indicated by the rust on these silos. Now, I don't know very much about Samsung engineering, but I don't know too many engineering companies older than about 10 years that don't have this problem, because there is an attractiveness to ownership culture where the owner is responsible for a given piece of code and quickly becomes the expert. And this can also apply to a small team. And they start not sharing their expertise except in the form of finished code. And pretty soon you have a loss of memory across the company about how each of the discrete pieces of the puzzle work. And this technical debt can be very dangerous because you're just one layoff away from people forgetting and there being an orphan code. The other problem that InnerSource helps with is when there are bottlenecks in your process. So for instance, people standing around waiting for somebody else to get something done before they can get their job done. In the InnerSource world, every single engineer is empowered to fix their own problems. And so they're only dependent on themselves. It's a much more efficient way to work. The last major reason that people use InnerSource is because they're looking for a way out of a lockstep of either their minds or the process that keeps them from innovating. So this is very famously why Bosch adopted InnerSource. They spend a lot of money convincing themselves in their R&D organization that this was the most efficient way to get really effective innovation. And now they're teaching the whole company how to do it. So this is not an abandonment of formalism. It's just a shift of responsibility for how things get done. So a shorthand way to think about it is, what if we switched from a feature request process where engineers ask for features from other experts to a pull request culture where every engineer is empowered to research the code and suggest their own changes. There is one more reason why InnerSource is a better choice, but it's a pending reason. Most of the younger resources that you can hire, even in Korea, I suspect, are expecting more transparency and more agency because they are digital natives. Because of how they use their phones, they expect to be able to solve their own problems. And they're not very happy as employees if they come into old-fashioned engineering. In fact, it's quite depressing for them. So over time, these will be the only people that you can hire. This shift is inevitable. What I'm talking about is getting in front of the trend, because not everyone will do that. It will make you a more effective hiring organization if it's known among your younger recruits that you work in this new way. And of course, the tooling has never been better for mass collaboration. GitHub is only one of the tools, but it is a very effective tool. If the goal is to allow every engineer in the company to be able to read your code across the company so that they can do their own research and suggest their own changes, you have no better tool than GitHub because it works at scale. Increasingly, we're trying to suggest new features to GitHub in better support of InnerSource, because most companies that are switching to GitHub Enterprise are really looking for the InnerSource effect. And unfortunately, although it's a very good tool set, it is not perfected yet for InnerSource. So now I'd like to welcome you to some of the characteristics of the InnerSource movement. This is our logo. We like it because it looks like a party is going on inside. And it also has a big eye for InnerSource. You'll see lots of versions of this logo throughout these slides. So the InnerSource community is growing and it's international. We just had our 11th InnerSource Summit. We've been doing them for a little more than 5 years. So 2 a year up until now. But this last one, we talked about the number of translations that have been done of our training materials. We are a nonprofit educational corporation that is dedicated to teaching this method. So everything that we create is working towards that goal. And we have created with O'Reilly Media a 4-video set of tutorials that discuss the roles that you encounter in InnerSource typically. And those tutorials have been translated into 5 languages so far, although Korean is not one of them yet. As open source and transparency have become the norm in Silicon Valley, it's surprising how many industries don't know exactly how to accomplish that. There's still a lot of lingering fear about working in this way. There's fear of losing IP. There's fundamental mistrust of the employees. And these create unfortunate inefficiencies. But as transparency becomes more expected, we're seeing more and more companies gaining efficiency by losing a bit of their paranoia. We're also seeing younger and younger groups of people being trained in these ideas, sometimes through the lens of open source, and sometimes straight up InnerSource being taught. So the question is, how are they different? I like to think that they're essentially the same, except that the transparency is limited in scope in InnerSource to the boundaries of the inside of your company. But teaching how to collaborate in this way could be done through either lens. If you have a practice of open source that only happens at the edges of your company, meaning only certain people are allowed to collaborate or contribute outside, then you're not doing the right thing to teach people how to collaborate across the company. And InnerSource should be considered, in addition to open source, as the broadest way to do that. The InnerSource community is growing. And in a minute, I'm going to show you a slide with the logos of companies that are now public about their InnerSource journey. But I want to say that just as with open source, InnerSource is people, but it is the people inside your organization and the people inside the InnerSource Commons. So we'll talk more about the InnerSource Commons in a minute, but this is a cultural change. It's a people change. And as I said before, it's growing around the world, which is really exciting to see. We've got a lot of new volunteers from Asia who, in addition to making translations, are donating to the Patterns community, which is a working group that's working on coming up with canonical patterns for how to implement InnerSource, and also anti-patterns. This is really exciting work, and they're getting ready to publish a set of these patterns as a beginning set. So that's pretty cool. Here's the slide I promised you of the many companies that are now talking publicly about InnerSource. They're doing it partly as a recruiting tool and partly because they want to share the lessons that they've learned. I started talking about this when I worked for PayPal 6 years ago now. Many of these other companies I've already mentioned, I've also done a fair amount of consulting into these companies to help them gain the subtleties of understanding how to do this. But I'd like to call your attention to two in particular. First of all, Comcast Universal. Comcast was already doing open source. They were already contributors. But they were finding that the open source projects they wanted to initiate weren't always landing so well because those teams were not the open source teams. So in order to teach collaboration and make sure that the teams are ready to build community when they start a new project, they now require that the team first establish an InnerSource community inside of Comcast before they go public, because it helps them understand how to build that community. And then the other company that I want you to look at is Microsoft. I gave a talk in Korea about 18 years ago about open source. It was very early days. It's when I was working for Sun. And our big nemesis was Microsoft, because their business model did not want transparency of code. So they fought against us. And when I spoke in Korea, what I got was a lot of the questions that Microsoft planted as fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I got questions about whether the security was good enough of open source. I got questions about whether it was legitimate as a code base if it was open source. I got lots and lots of FUD. And I think that held Korea back from open source involvement, and they were not alone. But Microsoft is now actively talking about the value of InnerSource inside their company, because the Azure platform was done as an open source project at the edge of the company. But it was a brilliant strategy. They were very happy with the results they got. And now they want to spread those same methods across the inside of Microsoft engineering. So they're turning to InnerSource to get that effect. And I'm really proud of that, because we fought against them for so long. But Tim O'Reilly said we would need to learn to be gracious in victory. And to me, this is that olive branch. This is a picture, a kind of old picture now, of the homepage of InnerSourceCommons.org. This is the website where the InnerSource Commons community puts all of its documentation, and this is where most people come first to ask for a Slack account. We really enjoy InnerSource Commons. It's a very nice community. It's a group of people, implementers, learning together how to do InnerSource implementation in the best way, and then sharing that information. And as I said before, you'll also find training materials, and also several books that have been written, including 3 that I was involved with, that have case studies, stories of InnerSource working or not working, and ideas about how they got those outcomes. So it should be very useful to join this. It's run under Chatham House rules, which means that we don't talk about who's there unless they're publicly speaking themselves about their InnerSource journey. So that picture with all the logos represents a small percentage of the total companies that are at InnerSource Commons. And that is the bulk of my message for you today. InnerSource is thriving. Companies are finding a lot of value out of it, and it's really helping modernize their engineering practice, which means that someday we may have most of the engineers in the world knowing how to work this way, which can only lead to better outcomes. It's so much more efficient. All right, here is a URL that you can go to at my current employer's Nearform to see a video of me talking about InnerSource, ask for a copy of my latest book, which we will mail to you, and generally ask questions. And here also is my email address. And I want to thank you for your attention and for this opportunity to speak again about this form of engineering, because I really believe that this is the way that everyone will work in another 10 years. I'm just trying to help you get there faster. So thank you again.